In the Dondurucu, freezing winter of 1475, the Ottoman Empire marched into a narrow valley with unshakable confidence. Their objective was clear: crush a defiant small principality and tear open the gateway to Central Europe. But what awaited them was neither fear nor surrender. Instead, they found a united people, silent, steady, and prepared for a lethal trap. High upon the frozen ridges, Prince Stephen watched as an army twice the size of his own approached. Every slope, every river crossing, and every wisp of fog had been strategically shaped for this singular moment. When the Ottomans finally stepped into the heart of the valley, the heavy silence was shattered. Arrows began to fall like a relentless winter rain. Hidden cannons roared through the haze, tearing through the Ottoman ranks with devastating force. Beneath the feet of fleeing soldiers, the frozen river groaned and split, swallowing entire formations into the icy depths. When the thick fog finally lifted, the sight was one of utter ruin. A mighty empire lay broken. A small nation had successfully held the gateway to Europe, and the echoes of that morning's victory would resonate across the continent for centuries to come. In the 15th century, Europe was a landscape of shifting borders and pervasive dread. To the south, the Ottoman Empire was rising with terrifying momentum. Having captured Constantinople, their armies pushed deeper into the Balkans every year. To many Europeans, the Ottomans seemed like an unstoppable storm, swallowing kingdoms as easily as the sea swallows a coastline. North of this expanding power lay Moldavia, a rural principality of dense forests and rolling valleys. It was neither wealthy nor heavily fortified, yet its location was vital. Sitting between the Ottomans, the Kingdom of Hungary, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whoever controlled Moldavia controlled the trade routes and the roadways into the heart of Europe. For Moldavia, there was no room for error. The man leading this small land was Stephen, later known as Stephen the Great. He had inherited a throne surrounded by neighbors who were far wealthier and more powerful. Stephen knew he could not compete with their massive treasuries or their endless waves of cavalry. Consequently, he ruled with extreme caution. He negotiated with precision, paid tribute when necessary, and did everything in his power to avoid provoking the giants at his borders. But even his legendary patience had its limits. Years of Ottoman expansion turned the pressure on Moldavia into an unbearable weight. Demands for taxes grew heavier, and political interference became more aggressive. The struggle for control over key ports like Chilia and Satatia Alba became a constant source of friction. Stephen observed other small states attempting to appease the Sultan, only to lose more territory each year. He recognized the pattern. Once an empire tightens its grip, it rarely lets go. By late 1474, the facade of peace collapsed. Istanbul saw Stephen's refusal to comply not as a disagreement, but as an act of defiance that needed to be crushed before it inspired others. When word reached Stephen that an Ottoman army of tens of thousands was gathering to march north, he didn't panic. He knew he couldn't outnumber them, but he could outthink them. As winter arrived with an unforgiving chill, Stephen began turning the very land of Moldavia into an obstacle. Villages near the southern frontier were quietly moved to safety, and food stores were relocated to ensure the invaders would find nothing to sustain them. Wells were covered, and forest paths were blocked or altered. He mapped the frozen river crossings in meticulous detail, knowing that an army unaware of where the ice was thin would suffer catastrophic losses before the first arrow was ever fired. The Moldavian people did not despair. They trusted Stephen implicitly. While the villages were cleared, Stephen reorganized his forces, focusing on speed and mobility. He centered his strategy on light cavalry, fast riders who could strike hard and vanish into the trees. Even the peasant levies, men with little armor but fierce loyalty, were given roles that utilized their intimate knowledge of the forest. By the time his preparations were complete, Stephen had gathered roughly 20,000 men. He made them no grand promises of easy victory. He told them only that their survival depended on fighting like Moldavians, quick, adaptable, and impossible to pin down. Stephen also sought help from other Christian rulers. He sent envoys to Poland and Hungary, warning that if Moldavia fell, the road to their own capitals would be wide open. Yet, when the messengers returned, they brought only polite words and empty sympathies. No soldiers were sent. Stephen accepted this cold reality with dignity. He realized that waiting for help would only waste the precious time he had left. As December passed, the Ottoman commander, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, led his massive force across the Danube. Stephen's response was to disappear. He retreated into the forests, creating an illusion of fear that lured the Ottomans deeper into his trap. Stephen chose his battlefield near the town of Vaslui, a place of marshes, narrow slopes, and thick morning fog. He studied the way sound traveled across the valley and where the ground turned soft beneath the snow. He ordered hidden trenches to be dug under layers of snow and positioned his archers behind ridges where they would remain invisible until the moment of the strike. To bait the hook further, Moldavian riders engaged in brief, chaotic skirmishes before retreating in feigned panic. To the Ottomans, it looked like a country in collapse. In reality, it was a masterpiece of tactical deception. Before dawn, on January 10th, 1475, a frozen fog rolled across the valley like thick smoke. Stephen had been waiting for this exact weather. The Ottomans, who relied on visibility and tight formations, would find their discipline neutralized by the white haze. The first sign of their advance was the dull, distant rumble of thousands of boots and hooves. They entered the valley in long, cramped columns, believing the Moldavians were still in full retreat. They were wrong. Thousands of eyes were watching them from the silence of the heights. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of Moldavian war horns, the Bucium. The haunting notes echoed from different directions, making the valley itself seem alive and hostile. The Ottomans slowed, their confusion mounting in the mist. Then Stephen gave the order. A roar of arrows burst from the ridges. Because of the fog, the Ottomans couldn't see the archers, but the arrows found their marks with brutal precision. Panic began to take root as the Ottoman ranks struggled to form lines against an invisible enemy. Then came the thunder of the cannons, small mobile guns hidden in the woods that fired and repositioned before they could be targeted. Light cavalry charged out of the fog, slashing through the Ottoman flanks and vanishing back into the mist before a counterattack could be organized. Officers shouted conflicting orders as units accidentally retreated into their own allies. Stephen watched from a concealed ridge, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final blow. When the Ottoman confusion reached its peak, he signaled his main battalion for a full-scale charge. A deep, rolling blast from the trumpets signaled the descent. Moldavian infantry and elite guards swept down the slopes like an avalanche, crashing into an enemy that was already blinded and exhausted. The valley erupted into a frenzy of clashing steel and splintering shields. Horses slipped on frozen mud, and the hiss of falling arrows was drowned out by the screams of battle. The Ottoman standards, once proud symbols of an empire, began to fall one by one into the blood-stained snow. In a desperate attempt to regroup, some Ottoman units tried to fall back across the frozen river. However, the ice had been weakened by days of marching and Stephen's intentional sabotage. As the soldiers crowded onto the crossings, the ice gave way. Men were plunged into the freezing water, weighed down by their armor. Those who managed to reach the other side found no safety. Moldavian riders had circled behind the valley, cutting off any hope of a retreat. The massive army was trapped, pressed between the slopes, the river, and a relentless assault from all sides. By midday, the fog began to lift, revealing the true scale of the disaster. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers lay scattered across the frozen ground. Stephen did not celebrate immediately. He rode through the valley with the gravity of a commander who knew the war was far from over. He ordered his men not to pursue too far into the south, refusing to lose lives to recklessness. The Ottoman army was no longer a fighting force. It was a broken mass of survivors struggling to comprehend how their numbers had failed them so completely. As news of the victory spread, relief washed over the Moldavian countryside. Against all logic and the terrifying reputation of the Ottoman Empire, Moldavia had won. Stephen gathered his exhausted council that evening. They had stood against a force that should have crushed them, but Stephen was already looking ahead. He knew the empire would return, fueled by the humiliation of this defeat. He needed Europe to understand that Moldavia was not just a distant buffer, but a shield protecting them all. Messengers rode through the night to the courts of Hungary, Poland, and Rome. They described the events at Vaslui not as a boast, but as a dire warning. If Moldavia had fallen, the Ottomans would already be standing at the gates of Central Europe. Across the continent, the reaction was immediate. Kings who had ignored Stephen's pleas now praised him. In Rome, the Pope hailed him as the champion of Christendom. But while Europe celebrated with bells and prayers, Stephen remained at his post, reinforcing his fortresses and feeding his soldiers. As night fell over the valley of Vaslui, Moldavian soldiers lit torches along the ridges. The flames flickered across the snow, illuminating the ground where they had defended their home against impossible odds. Some prayed, others sat in silence, thinking of the fallen. Stephen looked over the valley one last time before returning to his camp. It was cold and it was silent, yet in that silence there was something earned, the breath of a nation that refused to be erased. Moldavia had survived, and because it survived, Europe had been given a chance to breathe again.